Thank you all for coming to today's webinar series. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Camilla, the Engagement Officer with the On-Farm Carbon Advice team. Today's webinar, I'm really excited about, is about repowering the future, and particularly on low carbon liquid fuels and how that sits in agriculture. So Michael Cashin used to be part of the energy team with the climate and natural resources. And so he will be going through this topic area today. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters in which we gather today. I'm currently on Wiradjuri country in Orange, and recognise their continuing connection to the land, water and community. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Indigenous peoples here today. So today's session will be recorded and will be available on our website, so feel free to go and have a look at those resources. There will be opportunities for questions at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to put any questions in the chat. At the end of the webinar, we will do our usual short survey for any feedback you might have about the content and the webinar series. Okay, so let's get started. So let me introduce you to Michael Cashin. So Michael is based in Wagga Wagga at the Agricultural Research Centre down there. He's been with the department for over 25 years in various extension-focused positions. Most recently, Michael was in the energy team with the Climate and Natural Resources Division, and it works with primary producers to improve energy efficiency and employ innovative and novel energy technologies. Fabulous. So, Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Camilla, and thank you for the opportunity to present in the OFCA webinar series. I really enjoyed the series to date, so I'd encourage those that haven't seen the whole series to go back and have a look at it. So a little focus today is about repowering the future and the focus on low carbon liquid fuels, which are an emerging space for ag and a huge opportunity for the sector. I'd like to acknowledge John O'Connor too, who's now retired, but worked as a bit of a two-man team for quite a number of years, particularly in the Beyond Fossil Diesel project, which I guess finished in December 24. And a lot of the work we've done in that space has sort of emerged from there. Okay, so I'd just like to draw on a number of documents that have come out recently, and I'd really actually recommend anybody read these documents. Deloitte have done some excellent work as part of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation's body of work, looking at low carbon liquid fuels and the potential for Australia. There's an executive summary which you can download from that link, but also a more detailed report, and I'll draw on some of that today, which is quite good. And also CSIRO has done some work on its own in terms of opportunities and priorities for low carbon liquid fuels, but also work with Boeing, trying to work out, I guess, the state of play for things like Sustainable Aviation Fuel, which is one of the low carbon liquid fuel options that can be produced. All right, so what are low carbon liquid fuels? Low carbon liquid fuels are basically a renewable substitute for conventional fossil-based fuels. There's various generations of those. You probably remember this, I guess the first generation of biodiesel and ethanol that we see in our fuel now, things like E10. The second generation type fuels are things like Sustainable Aviation Fuel, Renewable Diesel, and some of the synthetic e-fuels. You can make these new fuels from different ways. There's really, I guess, two different streams. There's the biogenic sources and pathways related to those. So they're biological materials, things like fats, oils, greases, sugars, any sort of fibre or waste-based feedstock, which has got a biological basis to it, or alternatively the synthetic pathways, which rely on capture of carbon dioxide or at point or out of the atmosphere, and the use of green electrons to convert water into green hydrogen, so they're called P2L. But basically they're designed as a drop-in replacement for fossil fuels. So these second generation fuels are more like the original fossil fuels. Okay, so things like SAF, RD, and these e-fuels. We have, it's always, I always like to know that we've tried things before we sort of try and push them, I guess. John and I had a project for a number of years where we ran renewable diesel. So the bottle on the back of the truck there, it's a 6-ton diesel electric hybrid truck. We ran that on 100% renewable diesel. which we got from friends of ours. It's a nest day product, just as a proof of concept and a conversation starter for farmers. It's different in terms of its properties to biodiesel. Biodiesel has some issues because it's got its chemical structure in terms of low temperature responses. It can only be run as about a 20% blend in most modern engines, whilst renewable diesel is very close to the chemical properties of fossil diesel and probably a little bit better in some spaces, and allows you to run 100% blend without any issues around warranty. Chemically, basically, renewable diesel and SAF are probably a little bit cleaner than the fossil oil equivalent, generally because of particularly with the diesel, because of the aromatics. That yellowing in the diesel you saw on the back of the truck is in response to the aromatics, and that causes some of the oxide buildups we have in the combustion chamber exhaust ports and some of the emissions that come from the exhaust. So these new fuels are a drop-in replacement and they do burn cleaner. Biodiesel is usually only run up to a 20% mix, and because of its the oxygen molecules within the chemical structure you can see on the right there, has issues at low temperature and can take in water as well. So there's some challenges there, but it's still a very good fuel. There's been a lot to date made around electrification, the opportunities to electrify, and the solutions that may mean. Of course, in terms of the adoption curve, if you look across the economy, different sectors or subsectors of the economy are likely to adopt electrification more rapidly than others. If you look at the graph there, basically, this is a time from 25 to 2050. You can see that the passenger light commercial fleet is likely to adopt and is adopting a lot of that technology already in various forms, even if it's hybrid. But the larger end of the sector, I guess the more productive sort of heavy haulage, high horsepower requirements, manufacturing, mining, agriculture, construction, etc., are likely to adopt it towards the end of the 2050 window, and therefore require some sort of fuel to be part of the decarbonisation process of the economy, but still need some sort of liquid replacement. And probably, I guess Deloitte's suggesting and Siren suggesting you're probably going to need around 30 billion litres of fuel towards the end of that time frame. So there's a need for it. This was reflected also in some work that the federal government did on their transport infrastructure net zero roadmap. And again, those heavy vehicles, rail, marine, aviation, prime industries, etc., likely to need some sort of low carbon liquid fuel replacement to continue to operate and be profitable, but also contribute to the decarbonisation of the economy. In Australia, we use around 56 billion litres of liquid fuel every year, and it accounts for around 32% of our emissions, or 150 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. In the hard-to-abate sectors such as aviation, heavy freight and prime industries, there's a need for other options. And you can see there's a bit of a sector comparison in terms of the fuel-related emissions across Australia. Obviously, transport and mining and aviation are going to be the big ones, and ag is only a small part of the overall emissions, but it's certainly part of the footprint. Okay. In terms of where that fuel's used, that 56 million litres a year, there's about 56% of it that comes in the country as diesel, 28% is petrol, and the balance is aviation fuel and fuel oil or bunker oil fuel, which we use in the ships. Interestingly enough, there's about 44% of that liquid fuel is used off-road, which contributes to some of the needs of the hard-to-abate sectors because of the tyranny distance, high horsepower requirements, long duty cycles, and just remote locations of operation. In terms of our oil, the source of our oil in Australia, this is quite a nice graph in terms of explaining the change over time. Australia used to produce a lot of its own petroleum, or refine a lot of petroleum here onshore. Over time, since about 2010, we've had a number of major refineries close. There's only 2 remaining refineries still in operation, one at Geelong and one in Queensland, owned by Ampol. And you can see that the production of petroleum in the country has decreased, and we're relying more and more on imported product. This, of course, can create some issues or concerns around fuel security. There's been some concern around that from groups like the military, etc., where we think that we could be trade exposed or supply risk, create exposures for our defence, but also the key industries that produce, food and do things, move things, transport food, etc. So that's a concern. And with the bulk of the fuel coming from overseas and predominantly from Asia, we don't need too many of those supply chains to be cut to be in peril. In New South Wales, we've done a lot of work. This is a report that we commissioned under a couple of projects ago, but looking at diesel use in New South Wales ag, and was completed by a movement. But BAT found at the time that about 84% of the energy consumption for the sector comes from diesel, and obviously the bulk of it's imported. And the reason for that for prime industries is, diesel is really energy dense, transports well, stores well, really fuel efficient, and has desirable torque characteristics. So it's been a fuel of choice for a long time, and anything that can sort of mimic that would be a good choice as the sector tries to decarbonise and start to meet not just national emission standards, but also desires for the market to have lower carbon footprints on their product. In terms of the production of low carbon liquid fuels, this graph refers to SAF, but it's a similar process for renewable diesel. In fact, you produce both products at the same time through these processes. There's a number of pathways to take various biological feedstocks to produce these new fuels. On the left there, you'll see hydroprocessing, which is referred to as the HEFA process, alcohol to jet, and Fischer-Tropsch. There, I guess the key pathways for biological material to be turned into these new innovative low carbon liquid fuels. The one at the bottom is powder liquid, is basically taking direct air capture or carbon dioxide from point sources and through electrolysis, splitting water to create new fuels in a more innovative way. Each of these technologies have various what they call TR levels. The HEFA technology is mature. Most in terms of life cycle analysis, most greenhouse gas reductions for jet fuel are 73, 84% reduction on what it would have been from a fossil source. And you can read on the right there each of the different technologies. As you move down the chart there on the slide, you can see the technologies are in development towards the bottom. HEFA is the most mature at the moment, which basically takes algae, cooking oil, plant oils, and tallow and turns them into lipids, which can then be turned into a new fuel source. In terms of a feedstock ladder in 2025, you can see that tallow, used cooking oil, canola, and the various oilseed crops, including carinata, are probably viable today using the HEFA process, which is hydroprocessing esters and fatty acids. In the medium term, there's probably other ways we can do that, including alcohol to jet using sugarcane as a fuel source, and then Fischer-Tropsch from ag residues and bagasse, which is a sugar cane byproduct. Over the longer term, things like waste, etc., could come into the mix, and things like P2L methanol, which is powder liquid methanol through the electrolysis process. At the bottom of the slide here, you can see other potential sources of the feedstock and the various processes to get them into a fuel, but they will require technological change to make them more economically viable. Just in terms of production cost range, this is a chart looking at the various low carbon liquid fuel pathways and their feedstocks and their cost of production compared to aviation fuel, which again is a similar trend for renewable diesel if you did it on a basis like that. The long-term average for the darker grey bay is the conventional jet fuel price. And Argus, which is a commodity forecaster, has got a predicted a SAF price range, which will be viable in terms of an industry moving towards a renewable fuel. And you can see there the industries, the processes and the feedstocks predominantly focused around HEFA, and the oil seeds and the waste fats are likely to be the most viable in that time frame, where the other processes have got a longer burn and need to produce their prices to be viable, economically viable. Interesting enough, it's suggested in these documents that the buyers are more likely to pay on abatement potential than volume, or dollars per volume. So the feedstock sources and production pathway is also very important. As the commercial reality is that the emitters will always look for the lowest abatement method, and they can also go into the market to buy, carbon offsets. So that's obviously competing against some of these products, and which is really interesting to see in the market. In terms of getting those costs down so they'd be more close to where people are comfortable at the moment and businesses operating at, innovation is required to reduce the production costs to increase adoption and reduce economic shocks. And you can see the various pathways here with HEFA, alcohol to jet, Fischer-Tropsch and P2L and the various fuel types there. Particularly with the HEFA, which is at the moment the most economically viable pathway to obtain low carbon liquid fuels. Feedstock is a major component of the cost stack. So any work that can be done to try and reduce that, either through feedstock production costs, improving productivity efficiencies in the fuel making, but also emissions back at farm, so lowering the carbon footprint of that product, will help make it a more economically viable fuel. Very excitingly, Australia is at the forefront of some of this research, and CSIRO, we've become aware of this through a series of webinars we've run over the last few years from Alan Green, but basically CSIRO have been able to, through genetic modification, plant breeding, been able to switch some of the cells in leaves and stems of plants to produce oil. This technology has now been sold onto New Seed, or part of New Farm Group, and they've just announced a joint partnership with BP to try and increase, I guess, the yield per hectare of these biological oils, which then can move into the fuel market and potentially reduce the cost of fuel per hectare, which I think is really exciting and probably a game changer for the sector. In terms of Australia's got a comparative advantage for these low carbon liquid fuels, which are going to be desired everywhere. The world's moving to a decarbonised platform. As Australia has got hard to abate sectors, so has the rest of the world, and will require low carbon liquid fuels to make the transition if they're going to make the transition. We have comparative advantage in terms of we have large land areas, we'll have a low population, and we're quite good and efficient at producing products like oil crops. Our current export value is around 3.9 billion per year in terms of sending our canola and other products overseas we've made into fuels. CSIRO is estimating that we could turn that around to, into it if we started to value add that onshore and actually take control of the value add and increase our production. We can probably go to about 12.8 billion litres a year. Again, this is by 2050, and we still need, at the moment, we're using about 56 billion a year. So it's a small part of the whole package, but it's certainly somewhat part of the solution. Just in conclusion, Australia has a number of hard-to-abate sectors that need a viable low-carbon liquid fuel product to transition to a low-emissions future. Otherwise, they just won't be a part of it. Low-carbon liquid fuels appear to be a feasible solution to displace fossil diesel and reduce emissions and improve fuel security. At the moment, biogenic pathways appear to be the most economically, with probably HEFA as a standout, but alcohol to jet, Fischer-Tropsch, depending on feedstock, are also viable and maybe become more viable as time goes on. Sorry. And for new feedstock to emerge. And Australia has an opportunity not only to produce food and fibre, but also fuel in a new greener world that requires low carbon liquid fuels in abundance. We're at a crossroads here. The question, I guess, is will we just produce the raw product and export it for the processing elsewhere, which we've done traditionally, or take advantage of this once-in-a-generation opportunity to value add here and reap the benefits? And I'll leave it there. I'm happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Michael. So with Sustainable Aviation Fuel and all these other low carbon liquid fuels, I heard that Heathrow Airport is already using SAF at Heathrow. Is that right?
Yeah, the European Union has a mandate in place that they've got to start to decarbonise aviation, and they're doing a stage blending process like we did with the fishing fleet and the prawn trawlers, where they slowly ramp up the amount of SAF within the mix. So all these fuels readily mix with fossil diesel equivalents, and it's a way of softening the cost shift. So, for instance, Camilla's aware that we did some work with the prawn industry in New South Wales. We ran around a 30-35% blend of renewable diesel in fossil diesel on trawlers, and that effectively gave them a 28 sort of 30% reduction in emissions. So it's not a bad way to do it, and it also softens the blow of the cost change. Yeah, so I mean, Qantas is. I just went to the Bush Summit in Wagga here recently, and Qantas was a part of that and also a sponsor. They're actively advocating for the development of oilseed production and also the diversion of that back into sustainable aviation fuel. so they can underpin their supply and their commitments around emissions. Yeah.
You and I went to a conference about Licella. How does Licella fit into the 4 technology types?
Yeah, it's a different variant again.
Yeah.
So it's using hot water to break down carbon products into their various different products, including plastics, but also carbon products into their molecular basis. So it's a slightly different process. Yeah.
Interesting.
The economics of it, I'm not sure about that. I think
Yeah,
it's still in development.
And globally, there is a lot of push in this space, isn't there? I mean, Canada, EU, they seem to really be sort of moving in this direction.
Yeah, I mean, there is, and I think there's been pressure domestically as well. I mean, it just comes down to cost. So, yeah, there's certainly pressures. There is a technical solution that does work. It's a drop-in solution. The cost differential is the challenge. And in countries like the US, the west coast of the US, Canada, etc., they've had policy settings in place to try and soften the differential between the cost of production or the retail cost and the fossil equivalent. So that prior to Trump has been a boon for the west coast of the west coast of the US. And to be honest, there's a blend of both ethanol and renewable diesel in all fuel in the US that people wouldn't even be aware of. But people could also, which is biodiesel. But in terms of moving to a renewable diesel product, yeah, it was mainly the West Coast because they had policy settings in place to subsidise basically production, but also consumption at the bowser to soften the differential. Yeah, but people were very happy with it.
How is the price for feedstock going to compete with growers' prices for grain? It's a very good question.
Yeah, well, it's got to be competitive. Like we can't expect like a canola farmer in southern New South Wales to not send his canola to the highest price bidder. It's got to be competitive. So I think that's true. I think we will see a bit of a displacement for grain, like in terms of if this market moves and it's a more profitable crop that they can grow, we will see a shift in the percentage of a farm that may be sown down to well season any given year. Obviously, they've still got to follow rotation, but farmers will follow where the money is.
Yeah. And further to that, if you get your crop off and then the waste product you could sell as well as, is that? Do you think
absolutely. I mean, the GM technology that Sorrow developed, which now Newseed own and working with BP, that is a game changer because Alan Green's suggesting that basically off a C4 sort of summer crop that you had there, which you let's say could be sunflowers or whatever, where you're harvesting for seed, the waste stream, so the leaves and the stems of the plant have a very high oil content if they've been genetically modified. So then that can be taken as a secondary form of income, which bolsters the oil yield per hectare. And they were talking about the equivalence of what a palm plantation oil yield will be per hectare. So it's an absolute game changer. And I think it's very exciting times. And I wish Newseed all the best for taking the commercial step to get into that in space and actually make something happen, which is really good.
Nikki's just saying you don't want to remove too much carbon from our soils, though. But I guess the plant's already producing that material.
Yeah, I mean, it'll just become part of the cropping rotation. And obviously, I mean, you'd still need to maintain your carbon from your soils and not take everything. But it's just another tool in the toolbox. That's what it comes down to. So.
And in terms of the competitive environment in Australia, I know that there are some big players sort of considering this and moving in this space. But I also heard that one wasn't sort of going ahead. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the barriers, perhaps, that are in place?
I think it comes down to economics, and I think we've got to be real about all these transitions to these lower carbon products, for instance, that do help with the planet, etc., often come at a higher cost than the fossil alternatives. So we've got to try and work as best we can to try and soften that barrier, whether it's through policy or science, to try and make them more economically affordable for people to make the transition, or they just won't do it. I think we're seeing some of that in the. There's an announcement by BHP this week or last week around their battery electric mining trucks in Western Australia. I think they're looking at some of the commercial realities of that, and then looking at potentially even these low carbon liquid fuels as another way to do a similar thing, and probably at a slower rate. It's hard for me to speak on their behalf, but I think when you're talking big money, they're not fools, so they need to make sense of what's around and what's coming and what the likely drivers might be. But yes, everything I've looked at in terms of low carbon liquid fuels does come at a higher cost than the fossil alternative, because we're not actually factoring the cost of the carbon we emit. Yeah.
Interestingly, this morning I was listening to the Rural Report, and they were talking to a New Zealand farmer who's just recently bought an electric tractor. And I mean, obviously there are some alternatives there, but I think previously you have said that the bridge is too big, or the gap is too big to bridge. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I think electric tractors, for instance, work well in some situations. If you're on an orchard or like a smaller area, like a vineyard or something like that, and you're coming back to base regularly, you can charge if you've got good connection to the network. When you go into large horsepower, long duty cycle, remote locations, that can be more challenging, I think. I think in the medium term, I think we're going to see tractors move into hybrid sort of setups where you've got basically a smaller diesel engine turning a generator, which essentially creates an electric drive for the vehicle, but reduces the amount of fuel consumed. And I think that's probably more likely, but you're still giving you the reliability around an internal combustion engine, probably potentially even powered by low carbon liquid fuels. So it's reducing emissions, but it's also giving the flexibility and the reliability that farmers or primary industries need, or miners, for instance, need. So that the mining industry's been using that for some time. And then a lot of their trucks have got electric drives in the transmission, and smaller diesel genset essentially powering the unit. So that's not new technology, and I think it's a good step in the right direction. Yeah.
And I guess one thing you and I have discussed in the past are these additives. So we're not talking like AdBlue, we're talking about something that goes in the fuel tank.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, there are, I guess, smaller steps we can take. Often the fuel that we get in the country is not the best quality. And there are additives around that do seem to have improved the efficiency of the burn in the engine. I just noticed that Ampol's got a product here, I think it's called Ampol Efficiency. I might be wrong there, but which is it's got a diesel additive in it. The talk in the lunchroom here is it does improve fuel efficiency from the guys that have had a bit of a go at it and take the time to record that sort of information. So there are other ways we can make subtle improvements. Obviously having smaller engines and some sort of hybridization, but there are also fuel additives which can go into the fuel, which improve the burn rate and reduce some of the emissions. And again, they are first little steps, and then if you wanted to move down the track, you can go to some of these renewable fuels as their cost comes down, or you've got the desire to decarbonise, and it makes things up.
Great. So Nikki's asking about the national feedstock strategy. If you have any insight about when that might be...
No, I haven't. I know there's been a number of macro assessments of feedstock, and I know New South Wales has just done one as well as part of their renewable fuel strategy for New South Wales, which will be released very soon. So New South Wales is obviously moving in that state, and they've done I think they used a consultant to do the feedstock assessment for them, but each of the states have done that at various stages, and I think Cyro's done that as well. In terms of the national feedstock strategy, I couldn't comment on that, but obviously it'll be interesting to keep an eye on that and see where we go. But yeah, I think we need to really consider some of our resources here, because at the moment we're sending a lot of them overseas, and I think a lot of people think they're going to food. But in reality, a lot of them, if they're going into a market that favours green fuel, they're being turned into fuel.
Yeah. And I guess further to that, in terms of reports that are coming out soon, the New South Wales government, DPIOD, are bringing out the emission abatement roadmap, which will be coming out hopefully before Christmas, which also highlights this need for feedstocks and low carbon liquid fuels as an abatement strategy.
For the SIRO developed oil crops, any comment on whether that's got much of a higher nitrogen demand than conventional oil crops?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, they've certainly tested in tobacco. They would know. I'm sure there's people like Alan Green can answer that. Yeah, good question about that. They probably do have higher nutrient requirements. So I'm not sure. But I could take it on merit and find out for you if you like. Some of that work in the genetic modification, I think, would be really interesting with sugarcane because you've got a C4 grass, the big biomass, and a lot of it's relatively wasteful. So if you could use that in other ways, I think it'd be great.
Yeah, all the energy canes are definitely high on our agenda at the moment. So
yeah, only one of the things the few macro assessments of feedstock that I've seen, they're a bit dismissive of the GM modified products, and I think that really shoots ourselves in the foot a little bit because potentially that could be a game changer. They're really looking at what we've got now and projecting that out as a sort of a flat line, whereas it could be very different. And I think we need to be mindful of that and account for that. Otherwise, we just see ourselves as the feedstock supply for the world, and undersell ourselves a little bit.
You've got my details. If you need anything, please reach out. But I really appreciate you coming today.
Thanks, Camilla.
Thank
Thanks
you,
for the opportunity,
Michael.
everyone.